When my son told the nurses, "Don't let my father into the delivery room," I thought I'd misheard. But there I was, standing outside the hospital, holding a handmade crib I'd spent weeks building. And I wasn't welcome to see my first grandchild. You probably think I was a terrible father. Maybe you're right. I wasn't always there. Divorce, long shifts at the carpentry shop, bills piling higher than my promises. I missed birthdays, baseball games, and dinners I swore I'd make. But what my son didn't know was that every absence came with a sacrifice he never saw. I paid his tuition when he thought I'd forgotten him. I sent money every month when he believed I'd abandoned him. And the night he waited alone at the baseball field, I was lying in a hospital bed, bleeding from an accident I never told him about. Now, years later, he thinks he's protecting his new family by keeping me away. But here's the thing about secrets. They have a way of clawing their way to the surface. What happened in the weeks after that phone call will shock you. And what my son learned about the man he thought he hated will change everything you think you know about family, forgiveness, and the cost of silence. Stay with me, because the moment he finally texted me, "If you're free, come to dinner tomorrow," was the day I realized redemption sometimes comes dressed as an invitation to meet your grandson. I've always believed that wood tells a story. Every knot, every grain, every flaw. It's a record of time, of storms weathered and seasons endured. My name is Frank Miller, and at 58 years old, I've learned that people aren't much different from wood. We carry our own knots, our own scars, and sometimes those flaws make us beautiful. But more often, they just remind us of what we've lost. I was 25 when David was born, and I thought fatherhood would be simple. Love your kid, provide for your kid, be there when they need you. But I didn't count on life turning into a storm. My marriage to Laura fell apart before David turned 10. She got custody, and I got every other weekend, at least on paper. In reality, my job as a carpenter meant long hours and even longer weeks. I worked where the jobs were, which was often miles away from the little house where David was growing up. The first few years after the divorce, I told myself distance was temporary, that I'd make up for the missed birthdays and school plays. I'd show up with gifts, with money, with anything that could prove I still cared. But no matter what I brought, it never seemed to fill the space I'd left empty. David changed as the years passed. When I'd pick him up, he'd stop running into my arms. Conversations got shorter. Smiles became rarer. I thought maybe it was just him growing up, but deep down, I knew better. He was learning to live without me. By the time he was 15, I was more of a guest than a father. Laura didn't hide her disdain when I came around, and I could feel David's loyalty to her tightening like a knot in a rope. I don't blame him. She was there. I wasn't. In my 40s, I tried to make amends. I invited David to fishing trips, offered to help him with college expenses, even sent him tools when I heard he was working on his first apartment. The responses were polite but distant. Always a thanks in a text, never a phone call. I told myself I'd take whatever I could get. Years rolled by like sawdust off my workbench. We saw each other at the occasional holiday, always surrounded by people, never alone. I'd catch him looking at me sometimes, like he wanted to say something, but the words never came. And I didn't push. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd say. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from my sister, Ellen. She was the kind of person who always knew everything before everyone else. "Frank," she said, her voice full of something I couldn't quite place. Excitement, maybe. "I heard from Sarah. She's expecting." It It took me a second to process. Sarah? As in David's wife? As in, you're going to be a grandfather, she said. I sat there in my shop, the smell of cedar and varnish hanging in the air, and felt something stir in me I hadn't felt in years. Hope. A grandchild. It felt like a second chance wrapped in a blanket. I imagined holding the baby, maybe even being there for David and Sarah, in a way I hadn't been able to for him before. Babies have a way of softening hearts. Maybe this would be the thing that bridged the gap between us. But then Ellen's voice dropped. Don't get your hopes too high, Frank. You know how David is. He might not want you too involved. Her words stung, but I brushed them off. People change when life changes. Becoming a parent changes you in ways nothing else can. David would see that. He'd understand me in a way he never had before. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. I typed out a message to David. Congratulations, son. I'm happy for you both. Let me know if there's anything I can do. I stared at it for a long time before hitting send. No response came that night or the next. Still, I held on to the image in my mind. Me standing in a hospital room, holding my grandchild. David, maybe even smiling. Maybe even saying, "Thanks for being here, Dad." I didn't know it then, but that little spark of hope was about to collide head-on with a reality I wasn't prepared for. Because while I saw this as an opportunity for healing, David might have seen it as something else entirely, a boundary he wasn't ready to let me cross. The weeks after I found out about the baby were a strange mix of excitement and silence. I told myself to be patient. New parents have a lot on their plate. But somewhere deep down, I could feel the distance pressing in like cold air seeping through a cracked window. David never called. The only messages I got were the occasional short replies to my texts. Thanks, Dad. We're doing fine. Busy right now. Nothing about the baby. Nothing about the due date. Nothing that felt like an invitation to be part of their world. I tried reaching out to Sarah. She had always been polite, the kind of woman who said all the right words, but never offered much more. When I called, she'd answer with a calm, even tone. Hi, Frank. How are you? I'm good, Sarah. How are you and the baby doing? We're fine. Thanks for asking. Just busy with work and doctor's appointments. Her voice had a warmth to it, but it was the kind of warmth you give to a stranger in a checkout line, not the warmth of family. One afternoon, I offered to help with some repairs around their house. Sarah hesitated before saying, "That's kind, but we've got it handled. It's just, this is kind of our little family project." Our little family project. The words stuck with me. She wasn't rude. She wasn't dismissive. But there was a wall there, a polite, well-built wall that said, "We're fine on our own." I told myself not to take it personally. People want their privacy, and maybe they'd come around once the baby was born. I clung to that thought like a man gripping a loose handrail on a shaky staircase. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing outside a closed door, knocking softly, waiting for someone to open it. A few weeks later, I ran into Sarah at the grocery store. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a cart full of baby supplies in front of her. I offered to carry the heavy bags to her car. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Frank. That would help." As I loaded the bags, she lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something. Her hand brushed the side of her purse, and she glanced around to make sure no one was watching. "Frank, I never told David, but last year, when we were in a tough spot financially, you sent me some money to help pay off our credit card. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I just wanted you to know I appreciate that. I froze for a second, surprised she brought it up. You never told him? She shook her head quickly. No, he he wouldn't understand. He thinks he has to handle everything on his own. If he knew, he might see it as interference. Her words hit me in a way I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that she'd kept a piece of me hidden from David. Maybe to protect me. Maybe to protect him. Or maybe to protect herself. When I got home that night, I sat in my workshop, sanding the edge of the crib I was building for my grandchild. My hands worked automatically, but my mind was spinning. Why wouldn't David understand? Why would help from his father feel like interference? I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was the crib, the baby, the hope that maybe holding my grandchild would break down the walls between us. But as the days ticked by, the signs were impossible to ignore. David avoided talking about the birth. He didn't send me updates. I didn't know the due date until Ellen mentioned it offhand. It was as if I was watching the biggest moment of my son's life happen through a frosted window. Blurry, distant, and cold. Still, I kept working on the crib. Every nail I hammered, every curve I smoothed felt like a small act of defiance against the silence. I told myself that when the time came, I'd show up with the crib. I'd show up with my heart in my hands, and maybe, just maybe, the door would open. I didn't know then that the door wouldn't just stay shut. It would be locked from the inside. The months leading up to the baby's birth felt like a long hallway, with doors I kept trying to open, only to find them locked. But I didn't stop trying. I started small. A set of handmade wooden toys for the nursery, a gift card for Sarah, tucked inside a card that read, "For the things you might need but won't think to buy." Every gesture was met with the same response, polite, brief, and distant. "Thanks, Dad," David would text. Never a call, never a "we appreciate it," just enough to acknowledge my effort without inviting more. One weekend, I drove over with my toolbox. I knew their house had a loose step on the porch and a faucet that wouldn't stop dripping. I figured it was a good excuse to be around. Sarah opened the door, surprised, but not unkind. "Frank, we didn't expect you." "I was in the neighborhood," I said, holding up the toolbox. "Thought I'd fix that step before someone trips." She hesitated, then let me in. David was in the living room, assembling a bookshelf. He glanced up, his expression flat. "Hey, Dad," he said, then went back to work. I fixed the step, tightened the faucet, even oiled the squeaky front door. By the time I left, the house felt a little sturdier, but the air between us didn't. Weeks later, Ellen invited me to a small family gathering at her house. She said David and Sarah would be there. I saw it as a chance, maybe even a turning point. The night of the party, I showed up with a bottle of wine and a hopeful smile. David was already there, sitting at the table with Sarah, talking with cousins. I tried to make conversation, asked him about work, about the nursery. His answers were short, clipped. Then, halfway through dinner, the room went quiet when David put down his fork and said, "Dad, you don't have to keep doing all this. Sending stuff, showing up. You don't need to try so hard to make it look like you care now." It was like someone had dropped a weight into my chest. I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm not trying to make it look like anything, David. I do care. He shrugged, like it didn't matter. It's fine. We're fine. Just, you don't have to. The conversation shifted to something else, but the words lingered, sharp and heavy. Later that night, as people milled around, I stepped outside to catch my breath. That's when my cousin Mark came over. He'd had a couple of drinks, the kind that loosened the tongue. You know, he said, leaning against the railing. David's got this whole story in his head about you. Thinks you walked out on him and his mom because you had another family somewhere. That you chose them over him. I stared at him, stunned. What? That's not true. I never... Mark held up a hand. I know it's not true, but that's what he believes. Laura told him things back then. You know how it was after the divorce. My mind reeled. I'd known there was resentment. I'd known there were misunderstandings. But another family. It was like hearing the floor creak under you right before it gives way. I wanted to march back in, demand to know why David believed that. But I stopped myself. Confrontation wouldn't fix this. Not tonight. Instead, I drove home in silence, the road stretching out in front of me, my headlights carving a lonely path through the dark. Back in my shop, I picked up the crib again. The smooth oak under my hands felt solid, dependable. Everything my relationship with David wasn't. Each stroke of the sandpaper, each turn of the screw was a silent promise. I'm still here, even if he can't see it, even if he doesn't believe it. But as I worked, Mark's words echoed in my mind. Another family. I didn't know how deep that belief ran in David's heart, but I knew one thing. It was a crack in the foundation. And if I didn't find a way to set it straight, the whole thing might collapse for good. It's a strange thing, realizing your son doesn't just resent you. He's built an entire history in his mind where you're the villain. And no matter how many truths you try to slip in, they just sink beneath the surface, never to be seen again. After Mark's drunken confession about David believing I'd left him for another family, I tried to look at my son's coldness with new eyes. Every clipped response, every polite but distant thanks, suddenly felt heavier. It wasn't just about missed birthdays or awkward dinners. It was about a betrayal he'd been told happened, a betrayal that never existed. One Saturday, I stopped by their house again, this time with a small rocking chair I'd built for the nursery. I knocked, waited, and when the door opened, David was standing there. He looked at the chair, then at me, his face unreadable. "That's nice," he said flatly. "I thought it might be useful," I said, setting it gently on the porch. He didn't invite me in. "We've already got one, but thanks." The way he said thanks felt like a polite way of closing a door in my face. I could feel the gap between us stretching wider, but I couldn't stop trying to bridge it. Inside, I could hear Sarah moving around, her voice low. I thought about stepping inside just to say hello, but David stayed in the doorway like a guard, his hand resting lightly against the frame. I stood there a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, take care of yourselves." He gave a small nod, then closed the door. Driving home, the words I didn't say pressed heavy in my chest. He thought I had another family. He thought I'd chosen them over him. And now, every gesture I made, every gift I brought, it must have looked like I was trying to rewrite history for my own comfort. The next week, I sent a message. "David, can we grab lunch?" My treat. Hours passed. Finally, a reply. "I'm busy. Maybe another time." It was always another time. The frustration gnawed at me. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake the truth into him. But how could I fight against a story he'd carried his whole life? One evening, I tried a different approach. I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, Frank." "Sarah, I don't want to put you in the middle, but I can't seem to get through to David." There was a pause. He thinks you're trying to make yourself look like the victim." The words cut deep. The victim? He sees the visits, the gifts, the offers to help as performance, like you're trying to show everyone you're the better man. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. "That's not what I'm doing, Sarah. I'm just trying to, I don't know, be his father. Be there now, even if I couldn't before." "I know," she said softly. "But he doesn't." Her words echoed long after I hung up. It was a strange kind of pain, being misunderstood in the exact way you feared most. I thought about stopping, about giving him space, letting him come to me when he was ready. But then I'd picture the baby, my grandchild, and I couldn't bear the thought of being a stranger to another generation of my own family. So I kept trying. I sent a box of books for the baby. No reply. I left a voicemail just to check in. No call back. It was like talking into a void. Then one Thursday afternoon, as I was sanding the crib for what felt like the 100th time, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "We're heading to the hospital tonight. It's time." I froze, staring at the words. My heart pounded. I waited for the second message, the one that said, "Come if you can." It never came. Hours passed. I paced the kitchen, checked my phone a dozen times. Nothing from David. Nothing from Sarah beyond that first message. When midnight came, I sat alone in my chair, the crib gleaming in the corner, ready for a baby I wasn't sure I'd ever meet. Somewhere in the city, my grandchild was being born, and I didn't know if I was even allowed to be in the same building. The crib sat in the back of my truck, wrapped in a thick, moving blanket to protect the finish. I'd spent weeks building it, sanding every edge smooth, staining it just the right shade of honey maple. It wasn't just furniture, it was a promise. When Sarah's message came in that they were heading to the hospital, I loaded the crib into the truck without hesitation. I didn't get an invitation, but I told myself that sometimes you just have to show up. The drive to the city took over 2 hours. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than usual, my mind replaying every possible scenario. I imagined walking into the waiting room, maybe seeing David tired but relieved, Sarah smiling faintly, someone placing the baby in my arms. By the time I pulled into the hospital parking lot, the sky had gone dark. The building's windows glowed against the night, a beacon for new life. My heart thudded with every step as I carried a small gift bag in one hand and my hope in the other. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly. I approached the front desk, trying to sound casual. "Hi, I'm here to see my son, David Miller. His wife, Sarah, just had a baby." The nurse glanced at her computer, then at me. Her expression softened in that careful way people use when they have bad news. "I'm sorry, sir. Your name isn't on the approved visitors list." "Oh, there must be some mistake." I tried to keep my voice even. "I'm his father." She checked the screen again, then looked back at me, her voice lower. "I understand, but the father of the baby requested that you not be admitted." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "He requested what?" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "He asked that you not be allowed to visit at this time." The words hit like a physical blow. My grip tightened on the gift bag until the handles dug into my palm. "I see," I said finally, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "Thank you." I turned and walked away from the desk, my legs moving on instinct. It felt like the air in the hospital was thicker than outside, pressing against my chest. I found myself in the parking garage, leaning against my truck, staring at the glowing windows of the maternity ward. Somewhere up there, my grandchild had just entered the world, and I was standing in a cold parking lot, shut out by my own son. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. The hospital lights reflected off the wet asphalt, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic. Finally, I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands resting on the steering wheel, but I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, the gift bag on the passenger seat, the crib still in the back. As I prepared to leave, my eyes caught movement in one of the windows. I glanced up, and there she was, Sarah. She was standing near the glass, holding something small in her arms. Even from a distance, I could see the tiredness in her posture, the way she leaned slightly, as if cradling a weight that was both heavy and precious. Her eyes scanned the parking lot, and for a brief second, they locked with mine. It wasn't long, just a flicker, but I saw it, the hesitation, the guilt. She didn't wave, didn't signal, but her expression said everything she couldn't. Then she turned away, disappearing from the window, leaving me staring at the reflection of my own face in the glass. I sat there a moment longer, the weight of that brief exchange pressing down on me. It wasn't an invitation, but it also wasn't rejection from her. And somehow, that sliver of doubt in her eyes kept me from driving away completely defeated. I didn't drive away right away. Something about leaving the parking lot felt like admitting defeat, like I was slamming a door on a chance I'd been waiting years for. So, I stayed there, parked under the dim yellow lights of the hospital garage, my engine off, my hands resting uselessly on the steering wheel. The rain had started again, soft at first, then steady. It tapped against the roof of the truck in a rhythm that felt almost cruel, like a clock, ticking away moments I couldn't get back. I rolled the window down slightly, breathing in the cool air, trying to imagine what was happening somewhere above me. Every so often, a nurse would walk past, her shoes squeaking on the wet pavement, the smell of antiseptic drifting faintly behind her. A few visitors came and went, some with balloons, others with flowers. They all had someone waiting for them inside, and I had no one. At some point, the night air grew colder, and I leaned back in my seat, staring up at the maternity ward windows. A faint light glowed from one of them, and I thought of Sarah, of the baby I might never meet. I wondered if David was holding his child, if he felt the kind of awe that knocks the wind out of you the first time you look into your newborn's eyes. It was then, faintly, almost imagined, that I heard it, a thin, high-pitched wail that cut through the quiet. A baby's cry. I froze, my chest tightening. It wasn't like I could know for sure it was my grandchild, but in that moment, I believed it was. My grandchild's first sounds in this world, reaching out into the night. And I was hearing them from a parking lot, sitting alone in a pickup truck. The weight of it all crashed into me then. Not just the moment, but everything that had led to it. Years of missed birthdays, empty weekends, conversations that never went deeper than polite small talk. I'd told myself there would be time to fix things. And now, here we were. The time was here, and I was still on the outside. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the rain, the occasional hum of a car engine, and the echo of that cry in my head. At some point, my phone buzzed on the seat beside me. I hesitated before picking it up, half expecting it to be a telemarketer or another wrong number. But when I turned it over, my breath caught. It was a message from Sarah. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words. No explanation, no follow-up. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. A dozen responses came to mind, but I didn't type any of them. I knew she couldn't say more. Not with David in the room. Not tonight. But those 2 words told me enough. She knew I was here. She knew I'd been turned away. And on some level, she didn't agree with it. I set the phone down and leaned back again, the glow of the hospital lights blurring through the rain on my windshield. It wasn't much, but that message was something. A crack in the wall. The hours slipped by. At some point, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the sky was starting to lighten in the east. The rain had stopped, and the parking lot was nearly empty. I started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet morning. As I pulled out of the garage, I glanced one last time at the window where I'd seen Sarah. It was dark now. I drove home with the crib still in the back of the truck, the baby still a stranger, and the knowledge that this wasn't the end of the story. If anything, it was only the beginning. A few days after the hospital, I found myself at Miller's Diner, the kind of place where time hadn't changed much in 30 years. Same cracked leather booths, same scent of coffee that had been brewing since the Reagan administration. I didn't go there often, but that morning, I needed something that felt familiar. That's when I saw him, Tommy Jenkins. We'd worked together at the mill back in the day. He was older now, heavier, with gray creeping into his beard, but his laugh was the same when he spotted me. "Frank Miller," he said, slapping my shoulder. "Man, it's been years." We caught up over coffee, swapping stories about work and old friends. Eventually, the conversation shifted, as it always does, to family. "You still in touch with David?" Tommy asked, stirring his coffee. I hesitated. "Not much. He just had a baby, but—" I trailed off. Tommy nodded knowingly. "I heard things were complicated. You know, back when you and Laura split, there was a lot of talk." My gut tightened. "Talk about what?" He leaned back, lowering his voice. "About you having another family. People said you were living with some woman in Columbus. That's why you were never around." I stared at him, stunned. "That's not true. I was working in Columbus because that's where the jobs were. I'd come back every weekend I could." "Yeah, I figured it was something like that," Tommy said. "But you know how rumors spread. And Laura, she didn't exactly shut them down. She told people you'd stop sending money too. Said she was raising David all on her own." My hands tightened around the coffee cup. "I sent money every month. I have the records, checks, bank transfers." Tommy shrugged. "I'm just telling you what people heard, and if David grew up hearing it too. Well, maybe that explains why he's the way he is now." It was like a puzzle piece sliding into place. All those years of distance, the way David looked at me like I was a stranger. He wasn't just upset about my absence. He thought I'd abandoned him completely. After Tommy left, I sat there alone, the hum of the diner fading into the background. My mind was racing. That night, I went home and pulled out the box I'd kept in the back of my closet for decades. Inside were old bank statements, copies of checks, receipts from the court-ordered child support. Every month was there, like clockwork. I stared at the numbers, thinking about all the birthdays and holidays I'd missed while working overtime to make those payments. Laura had taken the money, and David had grown up believing I'd given him nothing. As I sorted through the papers, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Just a simple question. How are you? It was strange. She rarely reached out first. I typed back, I'm fine, just working. How's the baby? She replied, healthy, growing fast. I hesitated, then asked, does David ever talk about me? There was a long pause before her reply came. Sometimes. It's complicated. I stared at the screen, my mind turning over her words. There was something in them. Something careful, deliberate. Like she knew more than she was saying. So I asked, Sarah, did David ever tell you what his mom said about me? Another pause. Then, I know what she told him. And I know, not all of it was true. That single line made my heart pound. What do you mean? I typed back quickly. But her reply was slower this time. Frank, it's not my place. David has to be ready to hear certain things. He's stubborn. I sat there, staring at the words. She knew. She knew at least part of the truth about what had happened back then. And she wasn't telling him because she thought he wouldn't listen. I put the phone down, my pulse still racing. The truth was out there, locked behind years of resentment and pride. And somehow, I had to find a way to break through it before it was too late. The box of old papers sat on my kitchen table like a time capsule. Each envelope and folded document a fragment of a story that David had never heard. I'd kept everything. Bank statements, canceled checks, letters from the court confirming each payment. I'd told myself I was just being thorough, but maybe some part of me always knew I'd need them one day. Beside the paperwork, I laid out the photos. There weren't many, but each one was a reminder of moments that felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. David at age 6, grinning with a missing tooth. A fishing trip when he was 9. Back when weekends with me were still something he looked forward to. A birthday card he'd drawn for me with stick figures and the words, Best Dad. Somewhere along the line, the smiles had faded. The drawings had stopped. And now, here we were, decades later, strangers separated by years of silence and half-truths. I stacked the documents neatly, slid the photos into a folder, and set everything inside a leather briefcase I hadn't used in years. It felt strange, like I was preparing for a trial. In some ways, maybe I was. That night, I sat in my workshop, the smell of sawdust grounding me as I thought about what needed to happen next. I couldn't just keep showing up at David's door with gifts and apologies. It wasn't working. If I wanted the truth to have any chance, I needed to put it in front of him, clearly, undeniably. I'd decided. The next time I saw David, I'd lay it all out. No more quiet attempts, no more avoiding the hard conversations. Just as I was closing the briefcase, my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. Can we meet? Alone. My brow furrowed. I typed back, is everything okay? It's fine, just there's something I think you need to know before you talk to David. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop the next afternoon. When I walked in, Sarah was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but there was something else there too. Hesitation. Frank, she said softly as I sat down. Sarah, what's this about? She glanced around before leaning in. I know you're planning to talk to David. I know you want to show him everything. About the money. the past, and I think you should. But, she hesitated, you need to understand something first. I frowned. Understand what? Her fingers tightened around the cup. David doesn't hate you because of the money. Yes, he grew up believing you didn't support him. Yes, he thought you chose another life. But that's not what really hurt him. A knot formed in my stomach. Then what is it? She looked at me for a long moment, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. He's angry because of something that happened when he was 12. Something he's never told you. And something you might not even remember. I leaned back, confused. 12? What happened when he was 12? Her gaze didn't waver. That's for him to tell you. But just know, when you go to him with the truth about the money, be ready. Because he's holding on to more than one story. And the other one, it's the one that still burns. I sat there, stunned. All this time, I thought I'd been fighting against one misunderstanding. Now I was being told there was another, a deeper wound I didn't even know existed. Sarah stood, smoothing her coat. I'll tell him you want to meet. But Frank, she hesitated at the door. Don't go in thinking the money will fix everything. This is bigger than that. I watched her leave, the sound of the door chime fading into the background. For the first time in years, I felt the ground shift under me. The confrontation I'd been preparing for wasn't just about child support or rumors. It was about something I hadn't even seen coming, and whatever it was, it had been waiting over 20 years to be said. We met at a quiet cafe just off Main Street, the kind of place where the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air and conversation stayed low. I arrived early, my briefcase on the seat beside me, every document and photograph carefully arranged. David walked in 10 minutes late, his shoulders tense, his eyes guarded. He spotted me, gave a curt nod, and sat across from me without taking off his coat. Thanks for coming, I started. He didn't reply right away. He ordered a black coffee, then leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His eyes flicked to the briefcase. You've got something to show me, right? More proof you're the victim? I took a breath. I'm not here to play the victim. I'm here to give you the truth. What you do with it is up to you. He gave a small, humorless laugh. Truth. You know, I've been hearing your version of the truth my whole life. Mom had hers. You had yours. Guess which one stuck? I opened the briefcase, sliding a stack of papers toward him. These are bank statements, checks, 20 years of support payments. I never stopped helping David, not once. He glanced at them but didn't pick them up. You think that's what this is about? The money? I hesitated. Isn't it? His eyes darkened. He leaned forward, his voice low. Do you remember when I was 12? The summer baseball league? The question caught me off guard. I searched my memory. You made the team, I said slowly. You were excited. I was supposed to come to your first game. He nodded, his jaw tightening. You said you'd be there. I waited. The game ended. Everyone's parents came. You didn't. The memory hit me like a blow. I remembered that day, but not the way he did. I remembered the rain that morning, the way I'd hurried through a job trying to finish in time to make the game. And then I remembered the accident. I was in the hospital that day, I said quietly. His brow furrowed. Hospital? I was working on a roof, I explained, my voice steady but heavy. I slipped, fell 12 feet, broke 2 ribs, cracked my collarbone. I couldn't even call you. I thought someone would tell you. David's eyes narrowed. Someone? Who? I hesitated. Your mom. I told her what happened when I could. I asked her to explain. David leaned back, shaking his head with a bitter laugh. She never said a word. She told me you just didn't show. She told me you had better things to do. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the cafe faded. I could see the realization working its way through his expression. The shock, the confusion, the anger. She knew, he said finally, his voice hard. She knew, and she didn't tell me. I nodded slowly. I'm sorry, David. I thought she'd explain. I thought you knew all these years. His hands curled into fists on the table. I sat there, thinking you didn't care enough to show up. I carried that with me for 20 years, and she let me. I wanted to reach across the table, but I didn't. I can't change what she told you. I can only tell you the truth now. David looked away, his jaw tight. For the first time in a long time, there was no outright hostility in his voice, just a kind of raw, unsettled hurt. This isn't just about the money, he said finally. It's about all the times I thought you didn't care, and now I find out maybe you did. Maybe I've been wrong. I didn't say anything. I knew better than to push. After a long silence, David stood. I need time. He left without looking back, the bell over the cafe door chiming softly behind him. I sat there alone, the papers still on the table, my coffee gone cold. The truth was out, but I didn't know if it would build a bridge between us, or just show us how wide the gap really was. David didn't show up again for 2 weeks. No calls, no texts. I didn't push. Sarah had warned me that pushing would only make him dig his heels in deeper. But the silence felt heavier now, because this time it wasn't just distance. It was distance filled with cracks where the truth had started to seep through. Then one Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed. A single message from David. Coffee, 3 p.m. The place from last time. I was there by 2:45, the briefcase beside me again, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us. David walked in at exactly 3:05. No hesitation this time. He looked different, still guarded, but there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not trust, but curiosity. He sat down, folded his hands on the table, and for a moment he just stared at me. When I left last time, he began, his voice tight. I told myself I wouldn't come back. I told myself it didn't matter if you had an excuse for that game when I was 12. It wouldn't change anything. I nodded slowly. But you came back. His jaw tightened. Because if that was a lie, then what else was? I reached for the briefcase, unlatched it, and slid another stack of documents across the table. I kept everything. Every payment, every letter. I don't show you this to make myself look good, David. I show you because you deserve to know what actually happened. He flipped through the papers slowly, his eyes scanning the dates, the amounts. His fingers hesitated over the oldest ones, handwritten checks from decades ago, the kind you had to sign in blue ink so they couldn't be photocopied. I thought Mom was paying for everything herself, he muttered. I know you did, I said quietly. That's what she wanted you to believe. He set the papers down, his hand tightening into a fist. All these years, I've been carrying around this anger, and it wasn't even... God, I don't even know what's true anymore. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a second, I saw the 12-year-old boy again, the one who waited on a bench with his glove, watching the sun go down without his dad in the stands. I'm sorry, I said, my voice low but steady. I'm sorry for every moment you felt I didn't care. I can't give those moments back. All I can do is tell you the truth now. David's head snapped up. The truth doesn't change the fact that you weren't there. I met his gaze. You're right. It doesn't. But I need you to know I wasn't absent because I didn't want to be there. I was absent because life and people got in the way. For a moment, the air between us was charged, his anger and my guilt colliding in the space of a few feet. David pushed back his chair abruptly. I need to think. He stood, running a hand over his jaw. His eyes were still stormy, but there was something else there. Uncertainty. As he reached the door, he paused. For the first time in years, he looked back at me, and his expression wasn't pure anger. It wasn't forgiveness either. But it was different. It was as if he was seeing me, not just as the villain of his story, but as a man. A flawed, complicated man who might not be the person he'd been told I was. Then he left, the bell over the door ringing softly behind him. I sat there long after he was gone, my coffee cold, the briefcase still half open. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But for the first time, it wasn't the end either. 3 months passed in silence. Not the bitter kind of silence I'd grown used to over the years. This was different. There were no sharp texts, no closed-door messages relayed through Sarah. It was just quiet. I told myself not to read into it. Maybe David needed space. Maybe he was still sorting through everything we'd talked about. I kept my distance, spent more time in the workshop. The crib I'd built was still in the corner, untouched. The grain of the wood catching the light each morning like it was waiting for its purpose. Then, one Thursday evening, as I was closing up the shop, my phone buzzed. If you're free, come to dinner tomorrow. I want you to meet your grandson. I stared at the screen, unsure if I was reading it right. I must have read the message a dozen times before it sank in. Dinner. Tomorrow. Grandson. It was the first time David had ever invited me into his home without a layer of politeness or obligation. The next day, I left the shop early. I showered, shaved, even put on the good shirt I usually saved for church and weddings. I considered bringing something, wine, dessert, but in the end, I decided the most important thing I could bring was myself, without pretense. As I pulled into their driveway, my heart was pounding. I half expected Sarah to open the door. Instead, it was David. He stood there for a moment, just looking at me. No smile, but no wall either. Then he stepped aside. Come in, Dad. It was the first time he'd called me that in years. Inside, the house smelled faintly of roasted chicken and something sweet. Sarah was in the kitchen, and she gave me a warm, if slightly cautious smile. But my attention was pulled to the living room, more specifically to the small bundle in the bassinet. That's him? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. David nodded. That's Matthew. I stepped closer, my chest tightening at the side of the tiny face. The small fists curled near his cheeks. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All I could do was take in the fact that this was my grandson, the child I hadn't been allowed to meet at the hospital, now just a few feet away. Do you want to hold him? David asked. I looked up, half expecting some kind of catch, but his expression was sincere. I nodded. David carefully lifted Matthew from the bassinet and placed him in my arms. I'd built hundreds of cribs, chairs, and tables in my life. I'd held heavy beams and delicate carvings. But nothing in my hands had ever felt as fragile or as important as the weight of that tiny boy. Hey there, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm your granddad. Matthew shifted slightly, his face scrunching before relaxing again. I could feel the warmth of his small body through the blanket, and for a moment, the years of distance and bitterness between me and David felt like they didn't exist. Sarah excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, leaving me and David alone in the living room. "You've been quiet these last few months," I said softly, still rocking Matthew gently. David sat on the arm of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "I needed time." I nodded. I figured. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me, his gaze steady. "I read all of it. The statements, the letters, everything you brought that day." I felt my stomach twist. And he exhaled slowly. "I talked to Sarah about what my mom told me, about what you told me, about what she's seen herself." I didn't say anything, just waited. He leaned back, his eyes on the floor. "Turns out, a lot of the things I believed for most of my life weren't exactly true." It was hard to breathe for a moment, hearing him say it out loud. "I'm not saying everything's fine now," he continued. "I'm still angry about some things. I still wish you'd been there more, but I don't think you were the man I thought you were." I swallowed hard. "David, I can't undo the years we lost. I can't change what your mom said or what you went through. But I never stopped caring. Not once." He nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. Then he glanced at Matthew, still in my arms. "I guess I didn't want to make the same mistake. Keeping you out of his life. Letting him grow up with just one side of the story. I don't want that for him." I looked down at Matthew, then back at David. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." The air between us was still fragile, like a bridge just barely built. But it was there. Dinner was quiet, but it wasn't strained. Sarah joined us, and we talked. Nothing deep, nothing about the past, just the kind of conversation families have when they're feeling their way back toward each other. When it was time to leave, David walked me to the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, he hesitated. "Dad?" I turned back. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Thanks for coming." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something I hadn't had in a long time. An opening. I got in my truck, the crib still in the back. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where it belonged. The weeks after that dinner felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground, steady enough to walk, but still soft in places. Like one wrong move could send us sinking back into old patterns. David didn't suddenly start calling me every day, and I didn't expect him to. There were no dramatic reunions, no sweeping declarations of forgiveness. But there were small moments, quiet and steady, that began to stitch the gap between us. Sometimes Sarah would invite me over for Sunday dinner. Other times, David would text a simple, "We're grilling tonight if you want to stop by." I'd bring something small, homemade bread, a bottle of iced tea, and I'd sit at their table, listening to the sound of my grandson's laughter. It wasn't the life I dreamed of years ago, but it was something. It was a start. I noticed the way David would linger in the room when I was holding Matthew, not saying much, but not leaving either. Sometimes he'd ask about the crib, about the work I was doing in my shop, and once he even brought over a chair that needed fixing, standing beside me as I showed him how to sand down the edges. We didn't talk about the past often, but when we did, it wasn't to argue. It was more like turning over old stones, not to dwell on what was under them, but to understand why they were there in the first place. One afternoon, as I was leaving, David stood at the door, holding Matthew. He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You know, I think Mom wanted me to be angry. I think it made things easier for her, and I let it. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We can't change what she did. We can only decide what we do now." He looked down at Matthew, then back at me. "Yeah, I don't want him growing up with just one side of the story." It was then I realized something important. For years, I'd thought justice would mean clearing my name, proving to David that I wasn't the man he believed I was. But sitting there, seeing my son with his own child, I understood that real justice wasn't about winning. It was about truth. And sometimes, truth takes time. The next time I visited, David handed Matthew to me without hesitation. The baby had grown heavier, his eyes brighter. I bounced him gently, feeling the small weight in my arms. I looked up, and for the first time, David's eyes met mine without the sharp edge of resentment. There was still caution there, still a history that couldn't be erased. But there was also something else, a kind of acceptance. And that's when it hit me. The change between us hadn't come from any grand gesture or sudden realization. It had come from time, from persistence, from truth that had been left to settle slowly until it could be seen clearly. We weren't the father and son we might have been if life had gone differently. But we were something real. And as I held my grandson, I realized that was enough. The story didn't end with a perfect reconciliation. It ended here, in a living room filled with quiet laughter, the smell of dinner drifting in from the kitchen, and the small, steady steps of a relationship rebuilt. I looked down at Matthew, sleeping in my arms, then at David, leaning against the doorway, watching us. And in that moment, I knew the most important thing. The anger was gone.